In December 1944, when the world believed Germany no longer had the strength to attack, Hitler unleashed a final desperate offensive. His objective was audacious: to break through the Ardennes, capture the strategic port of Antwerp, and cut the Allied front in two. To achieve this, he relied on the best of his troops, including the feared First SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, an elite unit forged on the Eastern Front, equipped with Tiger tanks and led by experienced and fanatical officers. Among the most prominent leaders of this division was Joachim Peiper, a young SS officer known for his aggressiveness and absolute loyalty to the regime. Peiper commanded an armored Kampfgruppe that spearheaded the German advance in the Ardennes offensive. At his side were figures such as Max Hansen and Werner Pötschke, responsible for the reconnaissance and armored support battalions, respectively. On the other side, the Americans were ill-prepared. Scattered troops, some recently arrived from training, held the front. However, the Allied response was swift. Bastogne was encircled, but the 101st Airborne held firm, and within 48 hours, Patton's Third Army maneuvered north to counterattack. The First SS Libstandata, fanatical, hardened, and on the brink. Adolf Hitler's First SS Panzer Division Leibstandata was, in theory, one of the best-trained units in the German army. But by December 1944, it was no longer the unbroken force that had paraded as the Führer's personal guard. It had fought on nearly every front and lost thousands of its veterans. What remained was a mixture of fanaticism, accumulated experience, and extreme fatigue. During the Eastern Front campaign, the Leibstandarte had earned a reputation among its own commanders as an aggressive, ruthless, and difficult division to stop. It saw action in urban battles, protracted sieges, and lightning counterattacks. It had learned to move quickly, improvise in chaos, and act with brutality, something its superiors valued as tactical efficiency. That combat experience, gained under extreme conditions, shaped the unit's style. Later in Normandy, it suffered some of the worst losses of any Waffen-SS division. In the summer of 1944, it directly clashed with British, Canadian, and American forces in close-quarters combat, constant bombardment, and armored vehicle engagements. For weeks, it fought through destroyed villages, minefields, and blocked roads. The result was devastating. They lost much of their original strength. Many of their most experienced commanders were killed or out of action. The unit was forced to retreat. They were no longer the same. When Hitler announced Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Leibstandarte was chosen as one of the key divisions to open the Western Front. The mission was to break through the American lines in the Ardennes, advance to the Meuse River, and seize control of strategic crossings. For that task, the German command activated Kampfgruppe Peiper, an armored column under the command of Joachim Peiper, one of the youngest and most ambitious officers in the SS. Peiper was known for his violent temper, his ability to act without hesitation, and his unwavering loyalty to Himmler. He had served as the Reichsführer SS's personal aide, but he preferred the front lines. During previous campaigns, he had proven he could move quickly, make decisions under pressure, and execute orders without question. That way of operating made him ideal, according to the High Command, to lead the Leibstandarte's initial push westward. However, the unit Peiper received was not the same Leibstandarte as in 1941. It was made up of a combination of weary veterans, inexperienced young recruits, and remnants reorganized after the French campaign. Many vehicles were new, but the crews were not. Some Tiger II tanks had barely been tested in combat. Most of the crews were facing the winter weather, mountainous terrain, and unpredictable conditions of the Western Front for the first time. Unit morale was marked by a mixture of pride and resignation. Some still believed in a possible victory, confident that the surprise attack would open a gap in the Allied front. Others knew the situation was critical. Supplies were lacking, fuel was scarce, and the routes were uncertain. But the order was to advance, break through the front, and reach the Meuse. There was no room for doubt. Sepp Dietrich himself, commander of the 6th Panzer Army, was in command of the group to which the Leibstandarte belonged. Although he displayed confidence in public, he knew privately that his army corps was not up to previous standards. The pressure was high, and Hitler's expectations were impossible. The plan demanded speed, coordination, and surprise, but Dietrich and his officers knew that advancing in winter, along secondary roads with a weakened army and under constant bombardment, would be much more difficult than the OKW maps promised. The night before the start of the offensive, the atmosphere in the Leibstandarte was tense. Maps were reviewed, routes were assigned, ammunition was distributed, and convoys were organized. Peiper prepared his column with precision. He knew that the success of the initial advance depended on not stalling. Any delay would allow the Americans to regroup. To maintain the pressure, he ordered additional supplies to be brought in his own tanks and in captured vehicles. The drivers were instructed not to stop for anything. In the early hours of December 16th, the offensive began. German artillery opened fire at various points along the front. In the Leibstandarte sector, fog obscured the initial movements. The columns set out along forest routes, avoiding the main roads. The terrain was frozen, and many units advanced with difficulty. Initial reports indicated that the enemy was surprised, but that resistance was rapidly increasing. In those first days, Peiper advanced rapidly, taking villages, overcoming obstacles, and eliminating pockets of resistance. But he also encountered logistical problems. The fuel that was supposed to resupply his column was not arriving in time. Some roads were impassable for the heaviest vehicles. American ambushes began to slow his pace. Even so, the order was still to advance. The contrast between the Leibstandarte's image of strength and its actual situation became evident. Although they remained a feared unit, their room for maneuver was limited. Every kilometer gained required brutal attrition. The crews slept little, ate poorly, and operated in extreme temperatures. The weather worsened and the fighting intensified. Some officers reported high casualties. Radios began to fail due to the cold. Supplies arrived late or were intercepted. A lack of fuel forced them to abandon vehicles, which were later recovered by the enemy. Peiper tried to reorganize his lines, but they were no longer advancing with the same ease. The initial momentum was beginning to fade. The commanders knew they could not retreat. The pressure from Berlin was constant. The regime's propaganda spoke of a decisive offensive, of a last chance. But on the ground, the reality was different. The First SS continued to fight ferociously, but was at the limit of its capabilities. The unit that had once been a symbol of absolute power now relied on improvised maneuvers, scarce resources, and desperate decisions. Its leaders still spoke of victory, but many soldiers thought only of surviving another day. For the Americans, the name Leibstandarte still represented a threat. But what they faced in the Ardennes was a shadow of what that unit had once been. With every village taken and every tank lost, the First SS's image of invulnerability began to crack. The weather, enemy resistance, and scarce resources accelerated its attrition. The division was advancing, yes, but at a very high cost. The offensive was just beginning, but for many in the Leibstandarte, it was already clear that they were not fighting a battle to win, but to resist the inevitable. Patton's divisions, tanks trained to break through fronts. During the second half of 1944, as the Western Front advanced through France and Luxembourg, the U.S. Third Army, led by George S. Patton, established itself as a key offensive force. Several armored units operated under his command, including the 4th and 10th Armored Divisions, considered critical pieces in counterattack operations. These divisions were selected for their mobility, operational discipline, and ability to engage enemy armor even under extreme conditions. The 4th Armored Division, led by General Hugh Gaffey, had proven its effectiveness since the Normandy campaign. It was structured with 3 combat commands, each capable of acting independently: CCA, CCB, and CCR. This configuration allowed the force to be divided into smaller, more agile units suited to different types of terrain and objectives. Patton considered this division his favorite, both for its aggressiveness and its ability to execute. In December, the 4th Division was one of the first to be mobilized north toward Bastonia. They advanced rapidly from Ardennes, crossing frozen villages and icy roads. However, the maneuver came at a high cost. One of its battalions lost 33 tanks in the attempt to break through to the besieged city. The troops encountered a fierce defense from the German 5th Parachute Division and a self-propelled gun brigade, which halted their push at Martelange, about 20 kilometers from the objective. Patton accepted no excuses. He gave the order to press forward without pause, with the clear message, "Advance without looking back." He knew every minute counted. The pressure was on to fulfill his promise to reach Bastonia before Christmas. The city was surrounded, and the 101st Airborne was holding out without reinforcements. The general was confident that his push from the south would open a gap in time. The 10th Armored Division, for its part, had a different but no less critical role. It was tasked with defending the southern flank of the encirclement. While the 4th attempted to reach the encirclement from Ardennes, the 10th held key positions to prevent German units from advancing eastward and overflowing the line. Its light and medium tank battalions, along with motorized infantry, faced repeated attacks, with terrain conditions that complicated each movement. The 10th Division soldiers operated in small villages, sometimes bogged down by snow and other times cut off by enemy artillery. Despite numerical inferiority in certain sectors, the division managed to hold the line, stemming German advances that sought to exploit its flank. Its role was to contain, resist, and give Patton's mobile forces time to execute a counterattack. On December 22nd, Eisenhower himself formally authorized Patton to launch the offensive from the south. The order was to halt the German advance, liberate Bastonia, and cut the enemy line toward Houffalize. To this end, Patton organized an initial assault with 3 divisions, the 26th, the 80th, and the 4th Armored Divisions. These units were to move in a coordinated manner along different routes but with the same objective, to break the German offensive at its base. The 26th Division, commanded by Willard S. Paul, advanced from the south, covering more than 25 kilometers before making contact with German forces near Wiltz. They faced the Führer's Grenadier Brigade, whose commanders were put out of action in the first hours of the encounter, causing disorganization among its ranks. It was one of the first engagements where the Americans managed to dismantle an enemy unit without being exposed to immediate counterattacks. The 80th Division, under Horace McBride, moved in parallel and encountered heavier resistance near Ettelbruck. German soldiers of the 352nd Volksgrenadier Regiment made a stand in urban areas, sparking house-to-house fighting. Despite the obstacles, McBride's men managed to consolidate their positions. Meanwhile, the 10th Armored Division continued to defend the eastern portion of the line. On the right flank, the 5th Infantry Division arrived from Echternach to reinforce the offensive. Although part of its force was still deployed to the east, one regiment was assigned to coordinate with the 10th Infantry. Both units planned a counterattack against the German Volksgrenadier Division, which was attempting to control the high points north of the Sauer River. That same day, General Charles Doane received orders to reinforce the defenses in the rear, especially along the Meuse River. Demolitions were prepared for more than 250 bridges in case German forces reached that area. This action sought to halt any crossing attempt and prevent the enemy from gaining access to logistical depots or routes to Verdun. Despite this, the command was confident that Patton's blow from the south would prevent them from reaching that point. Coordination between armored personnel, infantry, artillery, and engineers was key. The Third Army's divisions were not perfect, but they were organized so that each could adapt to new orders quickly. The combat commanders knew how to operate under pressure, and many of them had fought since the Normandy landings. At the tactical level, the American armored divisions were divided into 3 operational commands that acted as combined units. Each included tanks, mechanized infantry, self-propelled artillery, and reconnaissance units. This allowed them to attack in small groups and respond quickly to changes in the terrain. Unlike the Germans, who relied on routes and massive concentrations of vehicles, the Americans could divide their forces to more effectively flank, defend, or cut routes. The Fourth Army also had the support of the 87th, which assumed part of the 4th Division's front, allowing its complete concentration on the advance toward Bastonia. This tactical reorganization allowed Patton to concentrate fire and force on the enemy's weakest points. Over the next few days, the pressure on Patton's divisions increased. The terrain conditions were adverse: frozen roads, visibility limited by blizzards, mines hidden under the ice. Nevertheless, engineer teams cleared routes while tank columns advanced. In some sectors, the forward forces had to face ambushes by German units hidden in nearby woods. In one such advance, the 4th Armored Division reached Martelange, where it retook the initiative and forced the Germans to fall back. Sherman tanks and motorized infantry vehicles advanced in close formation, facing anti-tank fire from ruined houses and improvised fortifications. Despite the losses, they managed to keep the route open for 48 hours, allowing reinforcements to flow north. Air coordination also played an important role. Although the weather hampered flights when there was a clearing, Allied fighters attacked the German lines and cleared sectors where the armored columns were advancing. This relieved some of the pressure on the soldiers fighting on the front lines. The performance of the Third Army divisions in those days marked a turning point. They not only withstood the German pressure, but also managed to reverse the pace of the offensive. Operational discipline, the experience accumulated since Normandy, and flexible organization made it possible to keep the offensive going even with limited resources and under extreme conditions. By the end of December, the units under Patton's command were no longer just a holding force. They had become the engine of the Allied counterattack in the southern salient. The 4th and 10th Armored Divisions, along with the infantry divisions supporting them, demonstrated they could act as a coordinated offensive bloc. Patton's success was not due to technical or material superiority. German tanks were still more potent in one-on-one duels, but the Third Army divisions compensated for this disadvantage with maneuver, speed, mutual support, and a command that did not hesitate to push to the limit. The Third Army was advancing, and that meant the German plan was beginning to unravel. Hitler launches his final blow, the December 16th offensive. In the final months of 1944, Adolf Hitler faced collapse. The Eastern Front was retreating in the face of the Soviet push, and in the West, the Allies were at the gates of Germany. Against this backdrop, the dictator decided to launch a final offensive in the West. This was neither a defensive operation nor a tactical retreat. It was a total gamble. The idea was to surprise the Allied forces in Belgium and Luxembourg, divide their lines and force a strategic shift in the war. The plan was codenamed Wacht am Rhein. The objective was clear: launch a large-scale attack through the Ardennes, advance toward the Meuse River, and capture the port of Antwerp. Taking that point would cut the Allied front in two and shatter its logistical system. For Hitler, this could change the course of the war. The order came directly from the Führer. From his headquarters in East Prussia, he personally oversaw every phase of the design. He ignored the objections of his top generals, who considered the idea unfeasible. The terrain was difficult, the winter weather hampered mobility, and resources were limited. Despite this, Hitler ordered the concentration of sufficient forces to launch the offensive. The offensive was planned quietly. The German High Command mobilized nearly 30 divisions, including Panzer, infantry, paratrooper, and Volksgrenadier units. A new armored formation, the 6th Panzer Army, was created under the command of Sepp Dietrich. Other shock groups were also prepared, such as Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army and the 7th Army, tasked with covering the southern flank. Troops began to position themselves secretly. Night marches, radio silence, and secondary routes were used to avoid detection. Some units traveled up to 500 kilometers on foot or in vehicles for several weeks to reach the starting point. In parallel, tanks, cannons, and fuel depots were camouflaged in forests and small towns. The disguise worked. Allied intelligence services detected no unusual movements. By mid-December, everything was ready. The troops were concentrated along a front of more than 130 kilometers, in an area that was believed to be secondary. The chosen area in the Ardennes had already been used in 1940 during the invasion of France. At that time, the German army had managed to surprise the French. Hitler hoped to repeat the move. The difference was that this time the enemy was different, attrition was greater, and time was against them. On December 16th at 5:30 a.m., the offensive began. A barrage of more than 1,000 artillery pieces opened fire on the American positions. The bombardment lasted nearly 2 hours. It hit command posts, lines of communication, trenches, and logistical routes. The intention was to paralyze the enemy's ability to respond before launching the infantry. Once the preparatory firing was completed, the armored units advanced. The terrain was covered in snow and ice. The roads were narrow, slippery, and flanked by forests. Despite this, the German columns began to advance deep into Allied territory. The morning fog prevented aerial reconnaissance, giving the attackers an advantage. The Allied front line was made up of inexperienced American divisions. Some had been on the front lines for a short time. Others were in quiet sectors after previous engagements. In several cases, the units were outnumbered and outgunned. Confusion spread quickly. lines of communication were cut, and many platoons were isolated, uncertain whether to retreat, resist, or withdraw. On the northern sector, the 6th Panzer Army moved slowly but strongly. Among its columns was Kampfgruppe Piper, an elite grouping of Tiger and Panther tanks tasked with opening a path to the Meuse River. In the center, the 5th Panzer Army managed to penetrate between the positions of the 28th and 106th American Infantry Divisions. In the south, the 7th Army secured the flank against possible counterattacks from the Luxembourg region. The attack took the Allied High Command by surprise. Their reports considered a large-scale German offensive in that sector unlikely. Most resources were concentrated in the Aachen region, where a frontal attack was expected. The German gamble on the element of surprise paid off within the first 24 hours. However, not everything was working as planned. Congestion on the advance routes slowed the movement of armored vehicles. Some roads were blocked by damaged vehicles or stuck in the snow. Engineers worked tirelessly to clear the way, but the slowness in logistics was beginning to show. The most advanced columns were being distanced from their supplies. The weather was another obstacle. Temperatures were below zero, engines froze, weapons failed, and soldiers suffered from frostbite. Nights were long and movement was slow. Troops had to move in close formation, which made them more vulnerable to ambushes if the enemy reacted. Despite everything, Hitler ordered them to press on. He was convinced that victory depended on maintaining the momentum. He gave instructions that the advance should not be halted due to lack of fuel. The use of captured reserves was prioritized. The confiscation of abandoned enemy depots was also authorized. The objective remained Antwerp. Within the German command, some generals remained hesitant. They believed the front was stretched too thin and that success depended on variables beyond their control. But the Führer brooked no objections. He had defined the operation as the blow that will decide the fate of the Reich. The first 48 hours of the offensive showed mixed results. In some sectors, troops advanced without resistance. In others, the Americans were beginning to organize their defenses. The lack of coordination between German columns led to bottlenecks. Some key points were not captured in time. The Allied reaction accelerated. On December 17th, more intense fighting erupted. In several towns, German troops briefly took control before being driven back. Allied communications began to reorganize. Reserve divisions were sent north. Eisenhower mobilized armored units from France. The first holding orders were issued. Despite the problems, the offensive continued. The German command believed it was still possible to break through the front and reach the Meuse, but the accumulated delay was beginning to reduce the possibilities. The initial advantage of surprise was disappearing. Congested routes, fuel shortages, and growing resistance complicated the outlook. In Berlin, propaganda spread the message that the offensive was achieving its objectives. There was talk of a great victory underway. Images of advancing tanks, recaptured villages, and cheering troops were used. But at the front, commanders knew the margin for error was minimal. Every hour counted. The first reports of Allied counterattacks arrived on December 18th. Some positions retaken by the Americans indicated that the front was not completely broken. Piper continued to advance, but with difficulty. The supply line was lengthening and river crossings were not being taken in time. The advance was slower and more vulnerable. On the southern sector, the response was swifter. Troops of the Third Army began to reorganize. General Patton was already planning a turn north to halt the offensive. News of the attack had reached all levels of the Allied command. It was no longer a surprise, it was open battle. Operation Watch on the Rhine continued. Hitler was confident that the advance would reach the Meuse before December 24th. From then on, he believed that political chaos on the Allied side would force a withdrawal. But on the ground, actual conditions did not align with that expectation. Snow, enemy resistance, and execution errors threatened to halt the advance prematurely. December 16th marked the beginning of the Third Reich's final attempt to alter the course of the war in the West. It was a calculated, risky attack based on the hope of an Allied collapse. In its first hours, it generated confusion, retreats, and concern among the enemy commanders. But the question was not whether it had surprised, but whether it could sustain itself long enough to achieve its objective. Kampfgruppe Piper, a bloody advance to the Meuse. On December 16th, before dawn, Kampfgruppe Piper was ready. The column of more than 100 armored vehicles waited on a forest road near Blankenheim. The engines roared almost as the initial bombardment began. The group was the shock force of the First SS and had only one instruction: advance swiftly toward the Meuse River, leaving all resistance behind. Joachim Peiper, at 29 years old, was already considered a feared officer. He had fought in Russia, where his group had burned entire villages. He was a devoted Nazi, despised commanders without field experience, and demanded total dedication from his men. In the Ardennes, he was assigned the central role, to break the Allied line and create chaos. His route was Rollbahn D, a secondary road that passed through Honsfeld, Büllingen, Stavelot and Trois Ponts. On the first day, his unit broke through the Lossheim Pass without significant resistance. They reached Honsfeld on December 17th and captured large quantities of fuel. Peiper forced American prisoners to load his tanks at gunpoint. The column then continued toward Büllingen, facing enemy artillery and airstrikes. At Ligneville, Peiper encountered armored vehicles from the 9th Armored Division. There was fighting, but the column did not stop. They advanced, firing in all directions, leaving no enemy alive behind. In their wake, they left destruction and fear. For 2 days, his column traveled more than 40 kilometers into enemy territory. They crossed frozen forests, destroyed villages and narrow roads. The terrain was difficult, and weather conditions made every meter cost time and fuel. The column stretched and lost contact with its flanks. Despite this, Peiper continued to push. On December 18th, the group reached Stavelot. Peiper did not stop to secure the town, confident that the units behind him would retake it. Instead of digging in, he decided to continue toward Trois Ponts, seeking to cross the Somme River. But by the time he reached the bridge, the engineers of the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion had already blown it up. The first German tank fell into the water. Faced with the obstacle, Peiper turned northwest, following the Amblève Valley. He took La Glaise and crossed the river at Cheneux. He was attacked by American fighters. He lost several vehicles. Even so, he managed to cross the stream with part of his column. He then attempted to advance toward Werbeaumont, but the road was so narrow that damaged tanks blocked the way. It took hours to clear the road. While this was happening, the engineers of the 291st Battalion destroyed another bridge at Neuf-Moulins, blocking the passage to the Meuse. Peiper was forced to return to La Glaise, now with the column fragmented and running low on fuel. Malmedy, the crime that unleashed Allied fury. On the morning of December 17th, 1944, a small American column from the 285th Artillery Observation Battalion crossed Malmedy toward Saint-Vith. There were about 140 soldiers. At 11:45, they passed through the Bonnier crossroads, where they encountered a line of German tanks advancing toward the intersection. The vehicles belonged to Kampfgruppe Peiper, the vanguard of the First SS Libstandarte Adolf Hitler. The tanks opened fire without warning. After a brief, unequal exchange, the Americans surrendered. They crawled from their trucks, hands raised. A German tank officer with a clear English accent told them, "The First SS Panzer Division welcomes you to Belgium, gentlemen." No one answered. They all knew what it meant to be in the hands of the SS. According to post-war accounts, before the offensive began, Hitler had urged the 6th Panzer Army to advance without any human containment. There are no documents confirming this order, but many soldiers understood that they should not waste time with prisoners. Some officers, like Peiper, considered it an implicit directive. Others, like Warrant Officer Ernst Kohler, claimed to have received explicit instructions not to leave any Belgian civilians alive or capture any enemy. On that December 17th, the American prisoners were gathered in an open field near the Café Beaudarwais, a few steps from the crossing. The cold was intense and light snow was falling. The group was surrounded by German soldiers. Meanwhile, other members of the Kampfgruppe continued the march toward Ligneville. Peiper passed near the site in a half-track, joking with the prisoners. "It's a long way to Tipperary, boys." As time passed, more soldiers were brought to the camp. Around 2 o'clock, without a clear order and without warning, several Germans opened fire. Some used submachine guns, others automatic rifles. The Americans fell where they stood. Some tried to escape, others feigned death. Soldiers like James Matera managed to flee in the snow. Others took refuge in the Café Beaudarwais, but the Germans set it on fire and shot those who fled. Between 3 and midnight, only 17 survivors managed to reach the American lines. Some were wounded, others nearly frozen. One hid for hours under the icy water of a stream to avoid discovery. It is estimated that more than 80 soldiers were executed at Baugne's camp. Others died in the initial firefight. For many survivors, the image of their comrades falling without any chance of defense was forever etched in their memory. One of them only managed to say, "We had no chance." The news reached the headquarters of the American First Army that same afternoon at 16:30. The next day it was relayed to Eisenhower's headquarters. Within hours, it was decided to make the incident public. The emotional impact was immediate. By the evening of Monday the 18th, most Allied soldiers at the front knew what had happened. The reaction was swift. In the Amblève Valley, as Piper faced imminent defeat, he received reports of confusion in his rear. Major Gustav Knittel explained to him in German, "A good number have been eliminated at the crossing." It was the first time Piper had heard of the event that would forever mark his reputation. The effect on the American troops was clear. On December 21st, a regiment of the 26th Division issued an internal order. No SS soldiers or paratroopers will be taken prisoner. They will be shot down instantly. Although this directive was later withdrawn, several testimonies suggest that American soldiers began shooting German prisoners without hesitation. On January 1st, members of the still inexperienced 11th Armored Division executed 21 captured Germans near Chenogne. These events were not officially publicized, but they demonstrate how the murder at Malmedy hardened Allied attitudes. German brutality provoked reprisals. The incident at Malmedy was not the only one. Other executions by First SS troops were documented. 8 prisoners were murdered at Ligneville, 12 American soldiers and 3 civilians at Lavaux-Richard, several more at Honsfeld and dozens of civilians at Stavelot. In the villages of Steyr, Parfondruy and Renardmont, the 3rd Armored Division found the bodies of 117 civilians. Some were killed by Allied artillery fire, but many were eliminated by the SS. The trial for the massacre was held at Dachau after the war. 74 men were charged, including Sepp Dietrich and Joachim Piper. 43 received the death penalty, 22 life sentences, and others lesser sentences. However, many punishments were commuted. The American defense attorney argued that the confessions had been extracted under duress. Furthermore, evidence was presented that Piper was not at the exact scene when the shooting occurred. Piper claimed that he did not approve of the execution of prisoners, but his official report of the operation described the episode as an annihilation of an enemy motorized column at Baugne. His commander, Wilhelm Mohnke, recommended him for a decoration using those very words. The way the term Vernichtung was used in that report suggests they knew exactly what it entailed: eliminating surrendered combatants. There is no evidence that Dietrich knew about the event at the time. He died in retirement in 1968. Piper, for his part, was haunted by his past. In 1976, he was murdered in France when his house was set on fire by unknown assailants. He had lived in hiding for years, moving between countries to avoid reprisals. The crime at Malmedy became a symbol of the SS's disregard for the laws of war. Although numerically a minor massacre compared to other atrocities, its moral impact was immense. For the Americans, it confirmed that they were facing not just an enemy army, but an organization without limits. The executions of prisoners, the reprisals against civilians, and the systematic brutality demonstrated the influence of the methods of the Eastern Front. Many First SS soldiers had returned from combat in Russia, where killing prisoners was common. They brought that same style back to Belgium. Over the next few days, the story of the crime spread throughout the front line. Officers used the incident to strengthen the troops' resolve. The US media also reported widely on the event. Public outrage increased pressure to punish the perpetrators. On December 23rd, US forces retook control of the area. The bodies of the murdered soldiers remained in the snow. The scene was photographed and documented. The images were circulated among Allied commanders and used as evidence in subsequent trials. Piper was never acquitted. Although he was not directly present, his role as Kampfgruppe commander made him responsible. Post-war trials established that the chain of command bore responsibility for crimes committed by subordinates, even without direct orders. The Malmedy massacre was a turning point. From that moment on, Allied troops viewed the SS as an unscrupulous force. American soldiers, in particular, stopped trusting any symbol of surrender. The rules of engagement changed. In retrospect, that crime marked the fall of the myth of military discipline and honor that some still attributed to certain German units. The First SS had crossed a line, and although they would continue to fight, they could no longer hide their actions. Bastonia under siege, the 101st holds out against the impossible. On December 17th, as German columns advanced through the Ardennes, the town of Bastogne became a strategic objective. Its importance lay not in its size, but in its crossroads. 7 major routes passed through the town, making it a key element in the advance toward the Meuse. The Wehrmacht could not leave it behind without risking its rear. That day, the first German artillery shots hit the town center. Thousands of Belgian civilians and remnants of retreating American units took shelter in its streets. Some claimed enemy tanks were already at the gates. Tensions grew with each hour. However, General Troy Middleton, commanding the 8th Corps, stood firm. He knew that the Allied command had already activated its only reserve, the 18th Airborne Corps. On the night of the 17th, in freezing rain, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions crossed Belgium by truck. The journey from Reims was slow, with snowy roads and minimal visibility. The enemy intercepted some of the radio transmissions. German planes circled overhead, dropping flares. Even so, both divisions arrived on time. On December 18th, the 101st Airborne Division, under the provisional command of General Anthony McAuliffe, took up positions in Bastogne. There was no time for fortifications. They used destroyed buildings, barns, and houses as trenches. Around them, units of the 10th Armored Division and remnants of other formations occupied improvised defensive positions. By December 19th, the Germans began to close in. The Panzer Lehr, 2nd Panzer, and 26th Volksgrenadier Divisions encircled the city from 3 directions. The American troops were surrounded. The supply line from the south was cut off. The only open route was by air, but bad weather prevented it. That same day, Eisenhower ordered Patton to redirect his Third Army northward to break the encirclement. Meanwhile, the 101st Army had to hold out alone. The paratroopers had no air support or heavy artillery. They had little food, limited ammunition, and few tanks. Even so, they prepared to resist. On December 20th, the situation worsened. German troops attacked the eastern and northeastern approaches. The 501st and 506th Parachute Infantry Regiments repelled the breakout attempts. To the south, Kampfgruppe Kunkel captured Sibret and moved towards Seignonchamps. The pressure intensified. McAuliffe organized small reaction groups with tanks, light artillery, and mixed units to plug each gap. By December 21st, the paratroopers were completely cut off. The encirclement was complete. German artillery fire was constant. Ammunition was rationed. Some guns held only 10 shells. Doctors operated without morphine, and the wounded lay in unheated cellars. That day, General von Luttwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps, sent a letter to McAuliffe demanding surrender. The American officer read it in his underground barracks. His response was brief: "Nuts." The word puzzled the German messengers, who did not understand its exact meaning. One of the American officers translated it as, "Go to hell." This refusal became a symbol of resistance in Bastogne. On December 22nd, the Germans launched new attacks. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division attempted to infiltrate through Borcy. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division attacked from the southwest, near Seignonchamps. The 2nd Panzer Division to the north was held in reserve after advancing to Tenneville. The Luftwaffe dropped fuel barrels on the area, but most fell outside the perimeter. During the early morning of December 23rd, the weather improved. Clear skies allowed C-47s of the 9th Transportation Company to drop on Bastogne. More than 250 tons of supplies were dropped: ammunition, food, plasma, blankets. Some barrels fell outside the perimeter, but most were recovered. It was the first real relief for the defenders. That same day, the 101st launched local counterattacks. At Seignonchamps, Task Force Brown resisted a German offensive with light artillery and damaged tanks. At Marvy, the 10th Armored Division impeded the passage of the Panzer Lehr in close quarters fighting. Although they could not break the encirclement, they managed to hold it in check. On December 24th, the Germans launched one of their strongest attacks yet. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Regiment penetrated the lines of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment and advanced 1 kilometer to Hemrul. But as they entered the village, they were ambushed. The Americans destroyed all the tanks and eliminated all 200 enemy soldiers. Not a single German escaped. That night, morale was at rock bottom. Bad weather returned. Ammunition was still scarce. Food was minimal. But the troops knew Patton was approaching. Each night they heard closer artillery. Relief was expected by Christmas. On December 25th, the German attack was renewed. The 92nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment attempted to take Neuf, but was repulsed by the 51st Parachute Regiment. To the north, the 340th Volksgrenadier Regiment attacked Longchamp and Aubourcy. Although they gained ground, they were unable to consolidate their positions. The defenders celebrated Christmas with what they had. Some shared chocolate, others wrote letters that would never be sent. They knew they were enduring one of the toughest battles on the Western Front. On December 26th, at 4:45 p.m., a combat engineer reported to McAuliffe, "3 light tanks are approaching from the south. They look like ours." They were part of Patton's 4th Armored Division. They had broken through the encirclement at Assenois. The communication was brief. "We're here. Where are the Germans?" Bastonia wasn't liberated, but it was no longer isolated. The corridor opened by the 4th Division was still narrow and vulnerable. Nevertheless, it marked the end of the siege. Soldiers of the 101st were shouting and raising their weapons. McAuliffe said only, "I knew they would make it." On December 27th and 28th, Patton sent reinforcements along the opened road. The 6th Armoured and 35th Infantry Divisions advanced from Arlen to widen the gap. The German command recognized the threat. They warned, "There is a strip between St. Hubert and Bastogne through which the Americans can penetrate at any moment." The 101st Airborne held their positions. Many were not relieved. They continued fighting until January. The siege had been lifted, but the city was still under fire. Even so, the line would not be broken. The siege of Bastogne was a symbol. For the Germans, it represented a choke point. For the Allies, it was proof that they could still hold out under impossible conditions. And for the 101st Airborne, it meant becoming a legend. Patton's pivot, 48 hours to change the war. On December 19th, 1944, at headquarters in Verdun, the top Allied commanders met after receiving the first reports of the German advance in the Ardennes. Eisenhower, Bradley, and other senior officers discussed the magnitude of the attack. In that room, George S. Patton went ahead of everyone and offered to move his Third Army north to break the encirclement of Bastogne. He promised that in 48 hours he would be hitting the enemy lines. No one believed he could do it so quickly. Patton had already anticipated a possible German movement in that area. He had ordered his chiefs of staff to prepare 3 pivot plans. When Eisenhower asked him how long he needed to move, Patton replied, 48 hours. General Bedell Smith hesitated. But Patton had already given the orders. His army, composed of more than 250,000 men, prepared to turn 90 degrees on its axis and launch itself toward a new front. That night, December 20th, the 4th Armored Division, the 26th Infantry Division, and the 80th Infantry Division began to move. The units regrouped in crossing zones south of Bastogne. The roads were covered with snow, the temperatures were below zero, and traffic was clogged with columns of retreating soldiers. Despite this, the engineers opened alternate routes and rerouted convoys to free the main thoroughfares. Patton didn't just move troops, he also coordinated artillery, field hospitals, supply units, and communications. He ordered every road cleared with snowplows and personally monitored weather reports. He left nothing to chance. As his men moved, he reviewed maps with the attention of a surgeon. On December 21st, the first elements of the Third Army reached the southern area of the encirclement. The 26th Infantry Division reached Neufchâteau. The 4th Armoured Division concentrated at Arlen. The troops were exhausted but ready to advance. Patton spoke with his commanders and reminded them of the objective, to open a corridor to Bastogne, no matter the cost. That same day, General Manteuffel, commanding the German 5th Panzer Army, received reports of the Allied movement. He acknowledged that such a rapid turn was unlikely but not impossible. He ordered the approaches to Bastogne to be reinforced from the south, although many of his units were already committed to fighting to the north. On December 22nd, the offensive began. The 4th Armoured Division launched itself from Ardennes toward Martelange, a town on the Sûre River. At first, the advance was smooth, but at Martelange, German engineers had blown up the main bridge. It took the Americans hours to set up a makeshift crossing. Meanwhile, enemy artillery pounded the area without pause. That same day, the 80th Infantry Division made contact with enemy units north of Ettelbruck. House-to-house fighting slowed the advance. The 26th Division, meanwhile, faced unexpected resistance at Neufchâteau, where a Volksgrenadier unit was holding its ground. Even so, all 3 divisions continued to push. On December 23rd, the weather cleared for the first time in days. Reconnaissance aircraft confirmed that Bastogne was still surrounded, but that the troops of the 101st Airborne were holding. The information was relayed to the Third Army. Patton ordered an accelerated pace. The 4th Armoured Division resumed the advance after building a new bridge over the Sûre. In the Bougainville area, American armor faced an organized defense. The Führer's Panzer Brigade had positioned anti-tank guns in narrow streets. In the fighting, the Americans lost 19 tanks, but continued to advance. The objective was to reach Assenois, the last town before Bastonia. That day, Third Army artillery opened coordinated fire in more than 10 sectors. Patton had concentrated 349 pieces of light, medium, and heavy guns. The fire broke through enemy lines and covered the tank advance. Observers in Bastonia heard the explosions and understood that rescue was near. Logistics were critical. Every tank needed fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and mechanical support. Transportation teams worked day and night. Engineers cleared routes under fire. Radio stations maintained constant communication with units at the front. The system worked. On December 24th, Patton ordered a final push toward Bastogne. The battle group led by Colonel Creighton Abrams with 45 Sherman tanks and 800 troops was given the direct mission of opening the breach. They advanced along a narrow, icy road flanked by trees where enemy units could hide. On the outskirts of Assenois, they encountered minefields. The sappers worked at full speed to clear a path. One tank hit a mine and was blown up. Another was hit by anti-tank fire. Despite the casualties, the group continued to advance. The pressure increased with every meter. At 4:45 p.m. on December 26th, a tank from the 37th Armoured Battalion broke through the enemy line and made contact with an outpost of the 326th Engineer Regiment at Bastonia. The encirclement had been broken. Troops from the 101st Airborne moved out to meet them. The encounter was brief but symbolic. McAuliffe sent a message to Patton. "Relieved, thanks." Patton responded with a terse note. "Promised, did it." The corridor opened was narrow and still under fire, but the connection was established. Reinforcements began to enter via that route. Supplies began to flow again. On December 27th, the pressure on Bastogne eased. Patton moved more units forward. The 6th Armoured Division reinforced the corridor. The 35th Infantry Division deployed east to secure the flanks. The German command attempted to close the gap, but it was too late. Patton's action had changed the course of the battle. In just 2 days, he turned an entire army and broke an encirclement the Germans had planned for weeks. The impact was strategic and moral. The troops of the 101st Army didn't just hold. They had bought time for the Third Army to arrive. Success wasn't just a merit of speed. It was a combination of advanced preparation, efficient logistics, direct leadership, and coordination between units. Each division knew what it had to do. Each commander understood the objective. Patton had imposed his style on the entire army. The Western Front changed with that maneuver. The Germans, still trying to advance toward the Meuse, were forced to withdraw units to contain Patton. They lost the initiative. The push from the south transformed the offensive into a defense. Bastonia became the turning point. On December 28th, the German High Command recognized that the advance toward Antwerp was unsustainable. The routes north of Bastogne were blocked. Fuel was running low. Columns like Pipers had already been halted. Hitler's plan was falling apart. In the following weeks, Patton continued pushing northeast. He liberated occupied towns, recaptured vital crossings, and linked his offensive with those of the Allied First and Third Armies. Coordination increased, and the front began to stabilize. The Third Army's pivot operation was later studied as a model of operational reaction under pressure. In the midst of winter, with no clear numerical advantage and limited resources, Patton managed to turn an emergency into a successful counteroffensive. The result was more than tactical. Allied morale recovered. The image of German invulnerability cracked. And in Bastonia, where resistance had reached its limit, the soldiers knew they were not alone. Battles between ice and steel, ambushes, tanks and mud. As the German offensive in the Ardennes progressed, it became clear that terrain, weather and vehicles would play as important a role as troops. The winter of 1944 was one of the harshest of the war. Temperatures dropped below -10 degrees Celsius. The ground was frozen, but with intermittent rains that turned the roads to mud and blocked the passage of tanks. In that region, the hills, thick forests, and narrow rural roads defined the way of fighting. Every bend in the road could hide an ambush. The mobility of motorized columns was limited. Infantry advanced on foot between frozen trees, crossing ravines and snow-covered fields. The terrain favored the defender and complicated rapid attacks. American tanks, primarily M4 Shermans, were fast and reliable, but light. Their armor could be penetrated by any German anti-tank weapon. They had a low-velocity gun that could barely pierce the front of a Panther or a Tiger. Their nickname among the Germans was Ronson, like lighters, because they exploded easily when hit. Even so, Shermans were numerous. Each American armored division had around 186 of them, and infantry divisions had an additional battalion of tanks. There were also M5 Stuart light tanks, used more as reconnaissance vehicles as their 37mm gun was ineffective against enemy armor. The Germans primarily used three models: the Panzer IV, the Panther, and the Tiger. The Panzer IV was the most common, with a good 75mm gun but relatively weak armor. The Panther was preferred for fighting in the Ardennes, fast, well protected, and with a gun capable of destroying any Sherman from long range. Tigers 1 and 2 were feared, with an 88mm gun and armor impervious from the front, but they were slow, heavy, and required large amounts of fuel. One of the main obstacles for both sides was the condition of the roads. Many were dirt or gravel tracks, impassable after rain or snow. Heavy vehicles easily got stuck. German tanks weighing 50 and even 70 tons were reported completely stuck in the mud. Some were abandoned without having fired a single shot. The lack of mobility forced a change in tactics. Ambushes became frequent. Tank columns advanced in single file along narrow roads with no room for lateral deployment. This allowed small groups of soldiers to hide anti-tank weapons around bends or at the entrances to towns. The Americans placed mines, fallen trees, and improvised barriers to slow enemy armor. Battles for crossroads became crucial. Seizing or holding a crossing meant controlling the passage of supplies, tanks, and reinforcements. Bastonia was the best-known case, but similar engagements occurred at Saint-Vith, Mannheim, Houffalize, and Clairvaux. Often, possession of a crossing decided whether a unit could advance or be surrounded. In the north, the American 2nd Armored Division captured the villages of Dauchamp and Marcourès after heavy fighting against the 560th Volksgrenadier Division. At the same time, the 3rd Armored Division and the 83rd Infantry advanced toward Régnier. In all these places, tanks moved with difficulty. The slopes and sharp turns limited their speed to less than 10 kilometers per hour. One disabled vehicle was enough to halt an entire column. Artillery also had problems. Batteries depended on visibility to adjust their fire, but the fog was so dense that in some sectors they could not see more than 300 meters. Observers could not accurately locate their targets. In other cases, the pieces had to be withdrawn for fear of being isolated if the enemy broke through. On December 22nd and 23rd, conditions worsened. Rain, snow, and fog impeded reconnaissance flights. The roads were covered with thick mud. On the 24th, during the final offensive toward Bastonia, the tanks of the 4th Armored Division took 6 hours to travel just 5 kilometers. Each bridge had to be evaluated. Some could not withstand the weight of a tank. The engineers improvised with logs, beams, or parts of other vehicles. The infantry, for their part, advanced slowly. Wet boots caused frostbite. Many soldiers lost fingers or feet. On some days, casualties per trench foot exceeded those caused by the enemy. In many units, medics could barely treat the wounded. There wasn't enough morphine. The frozen ground made it impossible to dig deep trenches. Some used destroyed houses as shelter, sharing the space with civilians, animals, and corpses. In January, with the Allied counterattack underway, fighting continued under extreme conditions. The 2nd Armoured Division attempted to advance from the north. Snowy terrain and mines slowed its progress. In many villages, such as Flamierge and Recrival, fighting raged house to house with flamethrowers, grenades and close-range gunfire. Tanks could barely enter the narrow streets. The Germans also faced serious problems. Their Panther and Tiger tanks were superior in armament, but their engines overheated and seized easily. Each model had high fuel consumption. With their tanks empty, many tanks were abandoned. Some crews destroyed them with explosives to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Others were captured intact. The uneven terrain forced German armor to advance in tight columns with no room to maneuver. Sepp Dietrich, commander of the 6th Panzer Army, summed it up this way: "Only 4 or 5 tanks can fight at the same time. There is no room to deploy. A massive armored attack is impossible here." A shortage of spare parts worsened the situation. The Germans used captured vehicles, including French and Italian models, for which there were no spare parts. Mechanics improvised repairs with incompatible parts. In many areas, tanks were used as static artillery, placed on rises to cover roads because they could no longer move. The Americans, although they had a logistical advantage, also suffered. The mud affected both trucks and armored vehicles. The 2.5-ton GMC vehicles were reliable but sank easily on the unpaved roads. Sometimes an entire battalion would be held up for hours waiting for a single vehicle to be towed. In the midst of it all, ambushes were constant. In the Grand Bois forest near Spineux, paratroopers of the 551st Battalion were surprised by the 62nd Volksgrenadier. Nearly all were killed. In another sector, the 17th Airborne Division took Recrival but was hit by German artillery before consolidating its position. Survivors described how the snow turned red in minutes. On January 6th, the 18th Airborne Corps attacked in a heavy blizzard. The men could barely see each other. Enemy fire came from ice-covered trees. American artillery could not provide support due to poor visibility. Advances were measured in meters. In some cases, it took 2 days to capture a single village. In the Tillet area, the 87th Infantry Division faced the Führer's escort brigade. The resistance was fierce. Every house was defended like a bunker. The Americans lost more than 100 men in a single day. However, they managed to reach the road to Marche. East of Bastonia, the 6th Armoured Division resisted attacks at Neffe and Warden. German artillery pounded. American tanks covered with lime for winter camouflage repelled night attacks among frozen trees. They slept with their feet wrapped in newspapers. They ate frozen rations. Some used dynamite to break up the soil and bury their dead. The mud, fog, and forests determined the pace of the battle. Victory depended not only on tanks or guns, but on physical endurance, steady logistics, and adaptation to the environment. The Battle of the Bulge was, more than anything, a war of attrition under the most extreme conditions. The 1st SS runs out of fuel, jam, retreat, and defeat. On December 20th, 1944, as the German offensive reached its deepest point, Kampfgruppe Peiper was trapped at La Gleize. Fuel reserves had been exhausted. Communications with the rest of the 1st SS were almost zero. Reports sent to Priess's headquarters confirmed the situation. Not a drop of gasoline, barely any ammunition. That day, 1st SS Commander Hermann Priess admitted that Peiper's group could no longer advance or defend itself effectively. Attempts to airdrop fuel failed. The Luftwaffe was unable to carry out its missions due to the weather. Jerrycans were falling outside the perimeter or being captured by the Americans. On the 21st, the situation did not improve. The 2nd SS Panzer Division reported that its units could not leave the assembly area due to lack of fuel. Reports spoke of tanks stopped, artillery immobile, and entire battalions waiting with no possibility of entering combat. Meanwhile, the 9th SS Panzer Division reported that only its reconnaissance battalion was mobile. Neither its Panthers nor its artillery pieces could be moved. That same day, Kampfgruppe Knittel attempted to cross the Amblev River to assist Peiper, but was repulsed by the American 30th Division. The bridge at Stavelot was blown up by Allied engineers. Germans who tried to ford the water were shot down. The escape route was sealed. To the south, other groups of the 1st SS were also stuck. Kampfgruppe Hansen, after failing to cross at Petit Spy, had to fight without tank support. Its attempt to open the road to Trois Ponts was repelled by paratroopers of the 55th Regiment. American engineers blew up the remaining bridges, forcing the Germans to retreat. Piper, out of options, ordered the destruction of their vehicles. Entire units burned their tanks and guns to prevent capture. On the night of December 23rd to 24th, some 800 men left L'Église on foot, crossing between Allied lines. They managed to return to German territory but left all their equipment behind. By December 24th, the First SS offensive was at a standstill. The lack of fuel had been an insurmountable obstacle. The Panthers, Tigers, and Panzer IVs required large quantities of gasoline, and supply routes were saturated or destroyed. The rugged terrain and winter weather doubled the expected consumption. Many tanks had only advanced a few kilometers before becoming immobile. The problems had been brewing since before the attack. On the night of December 15th, the 1st SS Panzer Corps barely had enough fuel to mobilize half of its divisions. The remainder was diverted from the 2nd SS Panzer Corps under the false premise that it would not be immediately needed. That decision had fatal consequences. The German High Command's logistical planning had been poor. Distant depots had been accumulated, safe from bombing but out of reach of combat units. The quartermaster headquarters were unaware of the true objective of the operation and did not prioritize frontal supply. The result was a broken chain. There was gasoline on the Rhine, but no trucks to deliver it to the Ardennes. On December 25th, units of the 2nd and 9th SS attempted to join the fight, but could barely move a portion of their forces. The 2nd Battalion of the 9th SS, equipped with Panzer IVs, received limited fuel. The Panthers did not leave the rear until the 28th. By then, the momentum of the offensive had been lost. Panzer Lehr reports also showed difficulties. At Moissy, its soldiers had to empty jerry cans by hand to fuel the engines. Supply was based on small quantities collected by each battalion. The same was true of the 116th Panzer Division. Of its 23 available Panthers, more than half were stalled due to lack of fuel. Piper, upon returning with the survivors of his Kampfgruppe, did not hide his frustration. He declared that they had not been told the truth about supplies. His unit was credited with advancing further than any other in the offensive, but at a very high cost. 70 tanks lost, hundreds of men killed, and failing to achieve its objective of reaching the Meuse. On December 26th, with the arrival of the first units of the Third Army at Bastonia, it became clear that the German plan was crumbling. The panzers were trapped on collapsed roads. Mud, mines, and blockades impeded any movement. The Allied gasoline depots at Spa and Stavelot, which could have saved the Germans, had already been evacuated or destroyed. In the following days, German commanders began ordering a withdrawal. The priority was to save soldiers, not vehicles. Tanks without gasoline were blown up by their own crews or abandoned by the roadside. The withdrawal was chaotic, without air support and under constant Allied pressure. On December 28th, the German High Command acknowledged that the objective of reaching the Meuse was unattainable. Hitler ordered them to hold the positions they had achieved, but the officers knew that a withdrawal was inevitable. By January 1st, many SS battalions were no longer fit to fight. Their forces were broken, disorganized, and poorly supplied. The lack of spare parts also played a role. Many damaged tanks could not be repaired. They cannibalized each other, but time was running out. In several divisions, mechanics tried to reactivate vehicles using incompatible parts. Some armored vehicles were used as fixed firing points, buried in the snow to serve as static cannons. On January 3rd, the Oberkommando reported that the offensive had to be halted. There were insufficient reserves. Only a small fraction of the 1st SS remained operational. Most of its tanks were destroyed or immobilized. Its troops, without transportation, walked back through the Ardennes. Operation Wacht am Rhein had failed. Fuel, more than bullets or soldiers, had been the decisive factor. The planners had relied on capturing Allied reserves rather than securing their own supply lines. That gamble proved costly. The withdrawal of the 1st SS marked the end of the myth of its invulnerability. Although still feared, it was no longer a force capable of turning the tide of the war. Its attempt to cross Belgium had ended in logistical disaster. Starting on January 5th, the SS divisions were regrouped and sent eastward. Hitler needed them to halt the Soviet offensive. What remained of the 1st SS embarked for the Eastern Front with few tanks, fewer soldiers, and a shattered reputation. The Battle of the Bulge proved that without fuel, no offensive was possible. No matter how veteran, fanatical, or well-armed they were, the men of the 1st SS could not advance beyond the limit marked by their empty tanks. The final collapse, the First SS facing its ultimate defeat. On January 1st, 1945, while Hitler was trying to salvage his offensive by launching parallel attacks in Alsace and against Allied airfields, the reality in the Ardennes was different. The First SS Panzer Division was exhausted. The soldiers were spent without logistical support or prospect of victory. Their withdrawal from the Bastonia front had already quietly begun. On January 3rd, the Americans resumed the offensive across the entire salient. The 6th Armored Division advanced toward Ardennes, while the 35th Infantry Division pressed from L'Outremange. In the German rear, the 1st SS received orders to concentrate in the Saint-Vite area. It was an implicit acknowledgement that its offensive role was over. On January 6th, Hitler authorized for the first time a partial withdrawal from the salient. The order included the 6th Panzer Army, which was to fall back toward the west wall. The plan was to conserve what remained of their units for the Eastern Front, where the Soviet offensive was already preparing. The 1st SS would be one of the first to leave. That same night, units of the 1st SS fought at L'Outremange against the American 35th Division. It was one of their last offensive actions in the region. Then they retreated north, crossing frozen roads under artillery fire. The terrain was mined. On January 9th, while American troops recaptured Harlung, the German High Command ordered the remnants of the 1st SS to regroup near Saint-Vite for transfer. There, under constant air surveillance, they waited their turn to embark for the east. The order had been clear: abandon the Western Front and head for Hungary. That same day, Patton launched a counterattack from Bastonia. 8 Allied divisions advanced north. The cold was extreme. Retreating German troops burned documents. The roads were clogged with mixed columns of infantry, artillery, and remnants of armored divisions. On January 11th, the US 90th Infantry Regiment closed a pocket near Oberwampach. Inside, remnants of the German 5th Parachute Division remained. The 1st SS attempted to open an escape route but was unsuccessful. The Parachute Division was virtually annihilated. Small groups managed to escape on foot. It was one of the last attempts by the 1st SS to accomplish a combat mission in the West. On January 12th, with the start of the Soviet offensive on the Vistula, Hitler gave total priority to the Eastern Front. He ordered the movement of all possible units toward Hungary, including the 1st SS, the 2nd SS, and the 12th SS. The process would be slow and difficult. On January 13th, while the Americans consolidated Houffalize, German columns attempted to escape along routes that had not yet been bombed. On January 15th, Hitler abandoned his headquarters in the west and headed for Berlin. The Ardennes offensive had failed, and his attention was now on the defense of the capital. On January 16th, troops from the American 1st and 3rd Armies met at Houffalize. The encirclement was completely closed. The remaining German units attempted to escape along secondary roads. Allied artillery rained down on any motorized columns. The clear skies allowed for massive air attacks. The roads were blocked. The 1st SS, by this time, had already left the front. Its last elements were shipped between January 17th and 21st to Austria and Hungary. The journey was slow. In many cases, trains had to be stopped due to track damage or air raids. Some cars never arrived. Units had to be reorganized at their destination. Meanwhile, officers from other German divisions expressed their discontent. Many viewed the SS withdrawal as a betrayal. While the regular infantry held off the Allied advance, the elite divisions retreated. The German command tried to calm the situation by saying they would return reinforced. No one believed it. By the end of January, the outcome was catastrophic. Of the more than 2,500 German armored vehicles on the Western Front by mid-December, only 800 remained. In the case of the 1st SS, its armored regiment retained barely a dozen operational vehicles. By January 25th, the Allied offensive had completely erased the salient. The front line was back in its original position. American troops advanced into Luxembourg and recaptured towns such as Clairvaux, Merscheid, and Hoscheid. On the 26th, the 6th Armored Division reoccupied Weiswampach, and the 90th Regiment took Grindhausen. That same day, in the east, the Soviet offensive in East Prussia began. Hitler no longer mentioned the Ardennes. The withdrawal to the West Wall had been completed. However, many units failed to cross. Allied bombing destroyed hundreds of vehicles and logistics depots during the retreat. On January 30th, OB West reports indicated that only 813 armoured vehicles were combat-ready on the entire Western Front. The First SS, which had begun the offensive as the spearhead, now barely appeared in operational reports. It had been eliminated as an offensive force in the West. Human losses were also extreme. The division lost more than 2,000 men between killed, wounded and missing. Some were trapped in pockets, others were taken prisoner in the final skirmishes. In several Belgian villages, the remains of completely destroyed SS columns were found. The reputation of the First SS was in jeopardy. Although its soldiers fought fiercely, the failure of their mission, the crimes committed, and the retreat under pressure proved that their reputation for invincibility was unfounded. It was no longer a feared division, it was just one of the Reich's worn-out units. The transfer to Hungary was no respite. In February, the First SS was launched into Operation Sudwind to halt the Soviet advance on the Danube. Its men, still reeling from the Ardennes, went into combat again. Many would never return. The Ardennes offensive was over. For the First SS, it was the beginning of the end. Its military prestige was destroyed. Its fighting capacity was decimated, and its history was forever marked by defeat, retreat, and the Malmedy massacre.